I never thought I'd be staring down a gang of HOA board members in a courtroom, but life has a funny way of turning vacant lots into battlegrounds. My name is Gabriel Benson, and the 3 acres of land I inherited from my grandfather became the most contentious property in Lakeside Springs, California. The morning I discovered the first tiny home on my lot still burns clear in my memory. It was a crisp autumn day in October when I drove past my property on the way to work. The vacant lot had been sitting empty for years, just on the outskirts of the Whispering Pines subdivision, technically part of the HOA's jurisdiction but virtually forgotten, until that day. I slammed on my brakes so hard my coffee sloshed onto my dashboard. There, sitting in the northwest corner of my property, was a quaint blue tiny home on wheels, complete with a small deck and potted plants. I pulled over, wondering if I was hallucinating. I hadn't authorized this, hadn't spoken to anyone about developing my land. As I approached, a woman stepped out of the tiny house. She looked about my age, early 30s, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "Hi there," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Nina Reynolds. Are you from the HOA board?" "No," I replied, confused. "I'm Gabriel Benson. I own this land." Her face paled. "But the HOA," she stopped, then turned to grab a folder from inside her home. "I signed a lease with the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association last week. They said this was community land designated for affordable housing." I examined the document she handed me. Sure enough, there was an official-looking lease agreement signed by Patricia Wilson, HOA president, and stamped with the association seal. "I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake," I said. "This is my private property. I inherited it from my grandfather 5 years ago." Nina's shoulders slumped. "I paid 3 months' rent in advance. I just moved in yesterday." I ran my hand through my hair, utterly bewildered. "Let me look into this. Don't pack up yet." There's clearly been a misunderstanding. That afternoon, I marched into the Whispering Pines HOA office, a converted ranch house at the entrance to the subdivision. The reception area was decorated with framed neighborhood awards and artificial plants. "I need to speak to Patricia Wilson," I told the receptionist, trying to keep my voice level. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked without looking up. "No, but she'll want to talk to me about the tiny home she authorized on my property." That got her attention. She disappeared down a hallway and returned moments later with a middle-aged woman whose platinum blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Mr. Benson, I presume?" She didn't offer her hand. "I'm Patricia Wilson." "Let's discuss this in my office." Her office was meticulously organized, with a large window overlooking the community garden. She took a seat behind her desk and gestured for me to sit opposite her. "Now, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "You've placed a tiny home on my land without permission," I said, "and apparently leased it to someone." Patricia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That land falls within our HOA boundaries, Mr. Benson. According to our charter, any undeveloped land can be utilized for community enhancement projects after a period of 5 years of inactivity." "That's absurd. I have the deed to that property. It's been in my family for generations." She slid a document across the desk. "This is Section 12, Paragraph 7 of our HOA covenants. Your grandfather signed this when the Whispering Pines subdivision was first developed. His land was incorporated into our jurisdiction." I scanned the document, my blood pressure rising. "This doesn't give you the right to develop my private property without consent." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "The board voted unanimously. We're addressing the affordable housing crisis in our area. The tiny homes project has been in planning for over a year." Notices were posted in the community newsletter. "I don't live in the community. I've never received your newsletter. We mailed notices to the address on file," she said dismissively. "It's not our fault if you didn't update your contact information." "This is illegal," I stated flatly. "You need to remove that structure immediately." Patricia's smile tightened. I'm afraid that won't be possible. We have 16 more homes scheduled for placement over the next month. The contractors have already been paid. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over. No, she agreed coolly. I suspect it isn't. The next day, I contacted a real estate attorney, Martin Green. His office was downtown, a modest suite in a brick building that had seen better days. Martin himself was in his 60s, with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. They can't just take your land, he said after I explained the situation. Regardless of what the HOA covenant says. That's what I thought, I replied, relieved to hear confirmation. Let me see the deed and any documents related to the property, Martin said. I handed over the folder I'd brought. There's one complication, I admitted. I haven't been out to the property much since my grandfather died. It's been sitting vacant. Martin nodded as he flipped through the papers. That could be an issue, but it doesn't give them development rights. When was the last time you paid property taxes? Every year on time. Good, that clearly establishes ongoing ownership. He closed the folder. I'll draft a cease and desist letter today. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos of the tiny home, any construction equipment, and keep a log of all communications with the HOA. I left Martin's office feeling somewhat better, but when I drove by my property that evening, my heart sank. 2 more tiny homes had appeared, one green, one yellow, both positioned neatly beside Nina's blue one. I parked and walked over. Nina was sitting on her small deck, a cup of tea in her hands. Your neighbors arrived, she said, gesturing to the other homes. Evelyn is in the green one. She's a retired teacher, and Marcus just moved into the yellow one. He's a nurse at Memorial Hospital. I sighed, looking at the tidy row of tiny houses. Nina, I want you to know I'm not angry at you or the other residents. This is between me and the HOA. I understand, she said quietly. But Gabriel, these homes mean everything to the people living in them. The rental market around here is impossible. I was living in my car before this opportunity came up. Her words hit me hard. I'd been focused on the principle it was my land and the HOA had no right to it. But now I was seeing the human side of the equation. I'm going to figure this out, I promised, not entirely sure what that meant anymore. The following week brought more tiny homes, 5 more to be exact, all positioned in a neat semicircle. Each one was uniquely painted but similar in design, roughly 250 square feet with clever storage solutions and small porches. Despite my anger at the HOA, I had to admit the little community forming on my land had a certain charm. I met some of the other residents. Derek, a veteran who worked at the local hardware store, Sophia, a single mother of 2 who ran an online crafting business, and James, a retired postal worker who spent his days tending to a small vegetable garden he'd started between the homes. Meanwhile, Martin sent the cease and desist letter, which Patricia Wilson promptly ignored. Instead, the HOA accelerated their timeline. By the end of the second week, all 17 planned tiny homes were in place, creating a horseshoe pattern around a central green space where the residents had started planting flowers and setting up picnic tables. I was in a quandary. The HOA was clearly in the wrong legally, but forcing these people out of their homes felt equally wrong. I decided to visit the tiny home community again, this time bringing coffee and donuts to facilitate a conversation with the residents. They gathered around one of the picnic tables, curious but wary about my intentions. I want to be transparent with all of you, I began. This land legally belongs to me, and the HOA had no right to develop it without my permission. Worried murmurs spread through the group. But, I continued, raising my hand for quiet, I understand that you've all made this your home. I'm not looking to evict anyone. The relief was palpable. So what happens now? Asked Marcus, the nurse from the yellow house. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. I'm still working that out. But I wanted you all to hear directly from me that I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Evelyn, the retired teacher, spoke up. The HOA charges us $500 a month in rent. Where does that money go? It was a good question, one I hadn't considered. At 17 homes, that was $8,500 monthly, a significant sum. I don't know, I said, but I intend to find out. That evening, I called Martin with a new approach. What if, instead of fighting the existence of the tiny homes, we focus on establishing my clear ownership of the land and the right to any income derived from it? Martin was quiet for a moment. That's an interesting angle. You'd essentially be accepting the current situation but asserting your property rights. Exactly. The homes are already there, the residents have nowhere else to go, and honestly, the community they're building is kind of wonderful. If the HOA wants to run an affordable housing program, fine, but they can't do it on my land without compensation. Let me research the best approach, Martin said. In the meantime, gather any evidence of the HOA collecting rent. The next day, I visited Nina and explained my plan. She agreed to share her lease agreement and rent receipts. Several other residents did the same. Each document showed the same thing. Patricia Wilson, signing as HOA president, was collecting substantial monthly payments. With this evidence in hand, Martin filed an emergency injunction to freeze the HOA's rental income from the tiny homes and to establish my legal ownership of both the land and any structures placed on it. 3 days later, I received a furious phone call from Patricia Wilson. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Those funds are essential for community improvements?" "You mean the funds you're collecting from my property without permission?" I countered. "The board will fight this," she threatened. "We have plans for that money." "I'm sure you do," I replied. "But until this is resolved, you won't be seeing another penny of it." The court date for the preliminary hearing was set for the following week. In the meantime, I continued getting to know the tiny home residents. They formed a tight-knit community, helping each other with repairs, sharing meals, and creating a communal garden. Despite the unusual circumstances, I found myself drawn to their resilience and camaraderie. Nina particularly intrigued me. She worked remotely as a graphic designer, creating illustrations for children's books. Her tiny home was filled with artwork and plants, somehow spacious despite its limited square footage. We often found ourselves talking late into the evening on her small deck, discussing everything from local politics to our favorite hiking trails. The day before the court hearing, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. It was Deanne Roberts, a member of the HOA board. Unlike Patricia, Deanne seemed uncomfortable and apologetic. "I wanted to speak with you privately," she said, glancing around nervously as if afraid of being seen. "There are things about the tiny homes project you should know." I invited her in, curious about what had prompted this clandestine visit. "Patricia didn't tell the entire board about the ownership dispute," Deanne explained once we were seated. She presented the project as if all permissions had been secured. "It wasn't until your injunction that most of us learned the truth." "And what is the truth, Deanne?" I asked. She pulled out a flash drive from her purse. The Tiny Homes project was supposed to cost $350,000, funded by a community development grant. But Patricia used only about half that amount for the actual homes. The rest. "The rest what?" "It's all on here," she said, placing the flash drive on my coffee table. "Financial records, board meeting minutes, emails." Patricia has been using HOA funds for personal expenses for years: designer clothes, luxury vacations, even a kitchen remodel. The Tiny Homes project was her biggest scheme yet. I stared at the flash drive. "Why are you telling me this?" Deanne's expression hardened. "Because what she's doing is wrong. Not just the misappropriation of funds, but using vulnerable people as pawns. Those residents deserve better." After Deanne left, I spent hours reviewing the documents on the flash drive. The evidence was damning. Patricia had not only misused HOA funds, but had specifically targeted my property, because it was large enough for her scheme yet belonged to someone who wasn't active in the community. The morning of the hearing, I met with Martin early to share what I'd learned. "This changes everything," he said after reviewing the documents. We're not just dealing with a property dispute anymore, this is fraud. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected. The entire HOA board was present, along with many residents from both Whispering Pines and the tiny home community. Patricia Wilson sat at the defendant's table, immaculately dressed and projecting confidence. Judge Elaine Harmon, a stern woman in her 60s, called the court to order. We're here regarding the case of Benson v. Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This is a preliminary hearing to determine property rights and the disposition of rental income. Mr. Green, you may present your case. Martin rose, straightening his tie. Your Honor, this case initially appeared to be a straightforward property dispute. My client, Gabriel Benson, owns a 3-acre parcel of land adjacent to the Whispering Pines subdivision. Without his knowledge or consent, the HOA placed 17 tiny homes on his property and began collecting rent from the residents. He approached the bench with my grandfather's deed and my property tax records. These documents clearly establish Mr. Benson's ownership. While the HOA claims jurisdiction under their covenant, they do not have development rights or the right to income derived from the property. The HOA's attorney, a slick man named Richard Taylor, countered with the HOA covenant, arguing that the property fell under their purview due to its location and my grandfather's original agreement when the subdivision was developed. Judge Harmon examined both documents carefully. Mr. Taylor, while the covenant does establish HOA jurisdiction for matters of appearance and maintenance, I see nothing that grants development rights or income rights to the association. Can you point me to that specific language? Taylor fumbled through the document. It's implied in Section 14, Your Honor. Implied is not sufficient for claiming development rights to private property, the judge stated firmly. Based on these documents alone, Mr. Benson's ownership claim appears valid. I could see Patricia whispering urgently to her attorney, her composure cracking slightly. Martin then moved to our second point. Your Honor, we've recently discovered evidence that the tiny homes project involves significant financial impropriety. He submitted Deanne's documents as evidence. These records show that Patricia Wilson, as HOA president, has misappropriated both grant money intended for the tiny homes and the rental income collected from residents. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Patricia's face flushed red. Objection, Taylor shouted. These allegations are outside the scope of today's hearing and based on stolen internal documents. Not stolen, Your Honor, Martin countered. Provided by a concerned board member who witnessed potential fraud. Judge Harmon reviewed the new evidence with a deepening frown. Mr. Taylor, these financial discrepancies are concerning and potentially relevant to the disposition of the rental income, which is within the scope of today's hearing. She turned to me. Mr. Benson, given your clear ownership rights, what outcome are you seeking here? I stood up, suddenly aware of all eyes on me, particularly those of the tiny home residents scattered throughout the courtroom. Your Honor, I'm not seeking to disrupt the lives of the people who have made their homes on my property. They're victims in this situation too. I'm asking for 3 things. First, legal confirmation of my ownership of both the land and the structures placed on it. Second, transfer of all rental agreements to me as the rightful landlord. And third, an accounting and return of all funds improperly collected by the HOA. Judge Harmon nodded thoughtfully. And the current residents? They stay, Your Honor. I have no desire to evict anyone. In fact, I'd like to formalize their residency with proper leases at the same affordable rates they were promised. Nina caught my eye from her seat, a smile spreading across her face. Patricia Wilson stood abruptly. This is absurd. The HOA has invested significant resources in developing that property. We can't simply hand it over, Miss Wilson, Judge Harmon said sharply. You developed property that wasn't yours to develop. Be grateful Mr. Benson isn't pursuing additional damages. After hearing further arguments from both sides, Judge Harmon issued her preliminary ruling. The injunction freezing the HOA's rental income would remain in place, and temporary ownership of both the land and structures was granted to me pending a final hearing. Additionally, she ordered a forensic audit of the HOA's finances and referred the potential fraud to the district attorney's office for investigation. As we left the courtroom, Patricia stormed past me, her face contorted with anger. "This isn't over, Benson," she hissed, but in many ways it was. The following weeks brought significant changes. The forensic audit revealed that Patricia had embezzled over $175,000 from the HOA over 3 years, including nearly $90,000 from the tiny homes project. The district attorney filed criminal charges, and Patricia resigned from the board in disgrace. The remaining board members, led by Deanne Roberts, who was elected interim president, worked with me to formalize the tiny homes community. We drew up proper leases, established clear guidelines for the common areas, and even applied for a legitimate grant to improve the infrastructure with proper water, sewer, and electrical connections. What had begun as an outrageous violation of my property rights evolved into something unexpected, a thriving micro-community that addressed a genuine need in our area. The residents formed their own council to manage day-to-day operations, with Nina serving as their representative in dealings with me and the HOA. 4 months after that first court hearing, we gathered for a community barbecue to celebrate the official opening of what we now called Harmony Gardens. The tiny homes had been connected to utilities. The central green space boasted garden beds and a small playground, and a sense of permanence had replaced the initial uncertainty. As the sun began to set, I found myself sitting beside Nina on a bench overlooking the community. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" she asked, watching children chase each other around the playground. "Not in a million years," I admitted. "I was so angry when I first saw that blue tiny house on my property." "Your property, your rules," she said with a smile. "That's what makes you different from Patricia. You saw people, not just an opportunity." Our conversation was interrupted by Marcus, who called everyone together for a toast. "To Gabriel," he said, raising his glass, "who could have kicked us all out but instead gave us a home." The residents cheered, and I felt a lump form in my throat. What had begun as a violation had transformed into something meaningful not just for them, but for me too. The final court hearing took place 6 months after the initial discovery of the tiny homes. By then, Patricia Wilson had accepted a plea deal for the embezzlement charges, agreeing to pay restitution and serve 2 years probation. The reorganized HOA board had formally recognized my ownership of the land and the structures on it. Judge Harmon made her final ruling official, granting me clear title to the property and all improvements. She also approved our proposed governance structure. I remained the landowner and technical landlord, while the Residents' Council handled day-to-day management of the community. This court rarely sees such a positive resolution to what began as a property dispute, Judge Harmon commented before adjourning. Both parties are to be commended for finding common ground. Outside the courthouse, Nina waited with several other residents. "So it's official?" she asked as I descended the steps. "Completely official," I confirmed. "Harmony Gardens is here to stay." Derek, the veteran, clapped me on the shoulder. "Never thought I'd be thanking someone for letting me pay them rent, but here we are." We laughed, and I realized how much had changed in 6 months. What began as an invasion of my property had become a community I was proud to be part of. The transformation of the vacant lot continued over the next year. With proper permits obtained retroactively, we added a small community center that doubled as a storm shelter. The residents installed a rainwater collection system for their expanded gardens and started a weekend farmers market that attracted visitors from surrounding neighborhoods. I found myself spending more time at Harmony Gardens, initially helping with repairs and improvements, but increasingly just enjoying the community. Nina and I grew closer, our initial landlord-tenant relationship evolving into friendship and eventually something more. One evening, as we walked the perimeter of the property discussing plans for a nature trail, Nina stopped suddenly. "You know, some people would say Patricia did you a favor," she said with a mischievous smile. "How do you figure that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, you had a vacant lot gathering weeds. Now you have rental income, a thriving community, and—" She gestured between us. "Other benefits," I laughed, pulling her close. "Let's not give Patricia too much credit. She's still serving probation for embezzlement." "Fair point," Nina conceded. "But sometimes good things come from bad intentions." She was right. Patricia's scheme had backfired spectacularly, but the outcome had enriched all our lives. The tiny homes that were placed on my property without permission had created a solution to a housing need none of us had fully recognized. 18 months after that first tiny blue house appeared on my land, Harmony Gardens hosted its first annual community celebration. All 17 tiny homes were now permanently established, with proper foundations, utilities, and individual garden plots. The central green space featured a gazebo where residents held weekly potlucks and occasional musical performances. Diane Roberts, now the permanent HOA president, approached me during the celebration. "You know, we've had inquiries from other neighborhoods about replicating this model," she said, surveying the thriving community. "People are calling it innovative urban planning." I chuckled. "Innovative is one word for it. Accidentally successful might be more accurate." "Sometimes the best ideas aren't planned," she replied. "The board is considering purchasing that vacant field on Oakwood Drive for a similar project properly this time, with all legal permissions in place." "I'd be happy to consult," I offered. There were definitely some lessons learned here. The biggest lesson, perhaps, was that property is more than just a legal right, it's a responsibility. My grandfather had left me that land with no specific instructions, but I like to think he would approve of how it was being used now. Patricia Wilson completed her probation and moved away from Lakeside Springs, reportedly to a retirement community in Arizona. The last I heard, she was banned from serving on any HOA board, a fitting restriction given her abuse of power. As for the residents of Harmony Gardens, they thrived. James expanded his vegetable garden into a small commercial operation, selling produce to local restaurants. Sophia's online crafting business grew enough that she could quit her second job. Evelyn started a tutoring program for neighborhood children, using the community center 3 afternoons a week. Nina and I eventually moved in together, not into one of the tiny homes, though we considered it. Instead, we bought a modest house just a few blocks away, close enough to remain deeply involved in the community, but with enough space for her art studio and my home office. 2 years after the court case, I received a letter from a national urban planning organization, inviting me to speak at their annual conference about the Harmony Gardens model of affordable housing. The letter described our community as an innovative approach to addressing housing insecurity through micro-communities integrated with existing neighborhoods. I showed the letter to Nina over breakfast, both of us amused by the formal language describing what had begun as an HOA land grab. "Are you going to tell them the origin story?" she asked, grinning over her coffee cup. "I'm thinking an abbreviated version," I replied. "Something like opportunities can arise from unexpected circumstances." Much more diplomatic than a power-hungry HOA president illegally developed my land, and I decided to roll with it, Nina laughed. I had come to appreciate the irony. Patricia Wilson had intended to exploit vulnerable people for personal gain, using my property as her canvas. Instead, she had inadvertently created a template for addressing a genuine community need, lost her position, and faced legal consequences for her actions. Meanwhile, 17 families had secure, affordable housing, and I had transformed from an absentee landowner to an engaged community partner. The vacant lot that had been nothing but a tax obligation and occasional headache had become a source of both income and profound satisfaction. The final chapter of this unexpected journey came 3 years after that first tiny home appeared. The City Council of Lakeside Springs passed a new ordinance specifically addressing micro-communities like Harmony Gardens, creating a clear legal framework for their establishment and operation. I was invited to the council meeting where the ordinance was unveiled, recognized as a pioneer in innovative housing solutions, a description that still made me smile given the circumstances. After the meeting, Mayor Lillian Chen pulled me aside. "You know, Gabriel, when this situation first erupted, the city attorneys thought it would end in disaster. Property disputes rarely conclude with everyone satisfied." "I had my moments of doubt too," I admitted. "What changed your mind?" she asked. "You could have fought to have those homes removed and won easily." I thought about it for a moment. I realized that being right legally wasn't the same as doing right by people. Once I met the residents and understood what those homes meant to them, eviction was never really an option. The mayor nodded thoughtfully. "That's a perspective more property owners could benefit from." She glanced at the framed ordinance in her hands. "This framework will help others create similar communities with proper permissions from the start, of course." As I drove home that evening, I took a detour through Harmony Gardens. The tiny homes glowed with warm light against the darkening sky, each one representing a life stabilized, a person given security in an increasingly unaffordable housing market. Children played in the central garden while adults chatted on their small porches or tended to their plots in the community garden. I parked near Nina's old blue tiny home, now occupied by a young teacher named Lucas, who had moved in 6 months earlier when Nina relocated to my house. The property had evolved into a true community with occasional turnover as residents' circumstances changed, but always maintaining its core identity as an affordable housing oasis. My phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "Dinner's ready when you are." "Did they make you the tiny house king of Lakeside Springs yet?" I smiled, typing back. "Something like that, be home soon." As I pulled away, I reflected on how differently this all could have gone. If I'd reacted purely from indignation and property rights, if I'd evicted everyone immediately, if I'd pressed charges against Patricia Wilson from the start, any of those paths would have led to a very different outcome. Instead, an HOA's overreach had inadvertently created something valuable not just for me or the residents, but for the broader community. The tiny homes that Patricia Wilson had placed on my vacant lot without permission had become a model for addressing housing needs throughout the region. Sometimes, I mused as I drove home to Nina, the most meaningful victories come not from winning battles but from transforming them into opportunities for something better. My grandfather's vacant lot had become so much more than property. It had become a community, a home, and an unexpected legacy that would outlast any deed or title. And that, perhaps, was the greatest plot twist of all.